Every single one of us was boring, or felt we were boring at some point in time. But are we really boring? Or are we just presenting ourselves to be boring in some way? I'd say it's the latter. Because everyone has their own unique experiences. Everyone has a universe inside of them, waiting to be discovered. And so you clicked on this video to learn 4 tricks to be more interesting, to not be boring. I'll give them to you. Number 1. It's kind of the most obvious. You want to be mysterious, right? You want to not give all the information about yourself. You don't want to expose yourself. You don't want to pour your life story out to them. Like, bleh. You don't want to do that. Right? You want to save certain things. You want to save the more specific things to yourself. You want to have them ask you about it. Because if they ask you about it, they'll be much more interested and they'll remember it. Rather than if you're just like, oh yeah, and this happened, and and this happened, and then further from that, this happened. Like, they'll be sleeping, right? They're going to be sleeping. So you want to wait for them to ask you about specific details, about some things. By being more mysterious, the other person's going to be more intrigued in you. You're basically inviting them to ask more questions about you. What you want to do is you want to touch a lot of topics, but you don't want to go into depth. You want to let them choose which topics they want to go into depth with. The key to being mysterious is you don't want to limit your topics. You don't want to just say 2 topics and then wait for them to be like, oh, what else do you do? Because chances are they aren't going to ask that. Right? They just aren't going to ask that. They're just going to assume that, you said 2 topics, okay, so you're interested in these 2 topics. But if you were to give them 5 topics, if you were to give them 10 topics, they would have so much more. They have so much more questions, They would be thinking about so much more. They have more options for them to pick with. Number 2 is have interesting stories. Storytelling is so fundamental to humans because stories are fundamental to the human experience. We tell stories all the time. And when we go to comedy shows, everything's a story basically. Right? A joke, we get to a joke from a story. A good lecture starts from a story. You are engaged when a story is being told. And so if you have interesting stories to tell, the other person will definitely be intrigued. The other person will definitely be interested. They'll be engaged. And so what you want to do is you always want to be prepared with at least one funny story. Take some time to actually think of it. Take some time to think about a funny story. Right? Like, we don't do this. Nobody tells us to do this. Sometimes we get lucky and then a funny story just keeps popping into our mind, and so we just tell it over and over again. But a lot of the time we don't have that. So you want to think about a funny time, think about making it into a funny story. Right? Write it out. Right? Be a comedy host for this one story. Write it out and memorize it. Right? And then test it. See how well it lands. And over time you get better and better. And you'll become more and more interesting. On the other hand, you also want to have a humiliating story. You want a story that shows that you're weak, in a sense. Right? Because by having a story that humiliates yourself, you show that this doesn't matter to me anymore. This weakness of mine, supposedly, in the story, is no longer a weakness because I can share it with people. I'm not embarrassed about this. And that shows strength. It shows strength that, I did this, it was a weakness, but I'm over it. I'm past it. I'm stronger than it. And same thing. Write this down. Practice. Storytelling is an art that a lot of us don't have anymore, and we need it. We need it, especially if you want to be interesting. You need it. So overall, you want to have a bunch of stories. You want to have a bunch of stories outlining the different perspectives in your life. Have a funny story, have a humiliating story. Those are 2 stories that you must have. Have other stories, right? Have stories that show that you care, that show that you love, show that you get angry. Show the different sides of yourself. And don't be afraid to share them. And for your story specifically, don't give the punchline at the beginning. That deflates the entire story. Right? Don't tell them the conclusion at the beginning of the story. Don't be like, yeah, so in the end, we didn't do anything, and then begin the story. It's like, no. No. You don't do that. You do not do that in storytelling. And so that is a no-go. That is an absolute no-no. Do not do that. So during the story, you want to build it up like an actual story, right? When you're telling it, you want it to build up to a climax. It's like any storytelling. You have your setting, you have your incline, or you're rising up, your climax, and then resolution. Right? 4 parts, basic story. And just follow that. It'll be good. And most of the time, just ending in a climax is good. Most of the time, you don't need a resolution. Because most of the time, the resolution is like, oh, and then this is the moral of the story. Don't do that. Let them figure it out. Don't give them the moral of the story. You want to let them have some autonomy during this process. Number 3 is do things. Actually do things and be more interesting, you know? Don't just sit at home and play video games all the time. Actually do things. You know? Experience the world. Because you can only fake it so much. Like if you don't have stories at all to tell, I think that's telling you to get more stories. Do things. Be a person. Actually be a person. Have interesting stories to tell. Have hobbies that you enjoy. And more importantly, be willing to share experiences from it. Be willing to tell stories from your hobbies. The more hobbies you have, the more experiences you have from those, the more stories you can tell. The more stories you have, the more interesting you'll become. And the 4th thing, which is probably the most important, is believe that you are interesting. Right? Believe that you yourself have something to offer that someone else does not know. Believe that, truly. And you'll be more interesting. You will think that you're more interesting, and therefore you'll be more interesting. You live up to what you think you are. Right? If you think you're a failure, you'll most likely live up to being a failure. If you think that you're a hero, a legend, if you really truly strive for it, you can become that. So you are unique. You have experiences that no one else has experienced before. You know what it's like to shove a finger up your butt. Okay, maybe that's a little weird. You know what it's like to sleep naked. You have so many things that you can tell. Because you're interesting. Use what is different about you. Incorporate these into your stories. Going back to the first trick, I wouldn't just say, oh, you know, I did this. No. It's like, you want to lead into some things. And it's best to have these as stories. If you can believe, you will succeed.